What's up, everybody? Today we are talking about the history of one of the most famous nameplates in American car history, a history that was successful and weird and disappointing and exciting and disappointing again. A nameplate that came and went for a little bit, came back for a little bit, went away for a long time, and came back once again. That is the Dodge Charger. I obviously have mine, my Scat Pack behind me. The first fun car that I bought, the first car that I bought with my own money, something near and dear to my heart. And so the Charger nameplate is near and dear to my heart. So we are today going through a brief history of the different generations, some special editions, some highs and lows of the Charger history. So let's get into it. So why was the Charger created? Well, the Charger was an answer to the pony cars and the muscle cars of the day. It was kind of one, kind of the other. You know, Ford launched the Ford Mustang in 1964 and a half, and then there was other muscle cars out there that were somewhat popular, but the pony car was really popular. The Mustang in 1964 and a half sold like over 1 million cars, and so, you know, that ended up leading to the Camaro, that led to Dodge having to act, and you combine that with, you know, the success of the Chevelle from Chevy and the Pontiac GTO and the Oldsmobile 442, and the Chrysler and Dodge wanted to also have their big hit in the American performance market. So then they came out with the first generation of Dodge Charger.
Join the Dodge Rebellion with the Dodge Boys!
Charger, new leader of the Dodge Rebellion. Muscle enough to catch anything on the road. Available with 4 barrels, dual exhaust, V8 power, hideaway headlights, 4 roomy bucket seats. Fabulous new full-size fastback. Charger.
So the first generation of the Dodge Charger was a short-lived generation. It was only for model years 1966 and 1967. It was actually based on the Dodge Coronet platform, where the Coronet was a somewhat sporty car with a big engine that Dodge had, but they then created the Charger, which had a fastback design like the Mustang did, with the flying buttresses, the nice hard angles, a great looking car. I genuinely think the first generation is good looking, not the best looking even of the old Chargers, but very good looking. And the other car that was popular that they took the fastback look from was then the second gen Corvette, which also had a fastback look. And those looks for the Mustang and the Corvette were very popular, and they wanted to emulate the fastback on the Charger, gave those nice flying buttresses with like the indented window. It looks really good. When it was first introduced, you could get it with the 5.2 liter V8, a 5.9 liter V8, a 6.3 liter V8, and all the way up to the 7.0 liter 426 Hemi V8, a legendary motor, big, loud, fast, awesome. And only 468 426 street Hemis were ever made for the first generation Charger, something that obviously makes them hold their value now if they're in good condition. You could get it with a 3-speed manual as standard. A 4-speed manual is an option, and so was a 3-speed automatic. Back then, automatics were really bad. Most people either got the standard 3-speed manual or the 4-speed manual. You know, if you really wanted the fast, fun, sporty, you went for the 4-speed manual, which is so funny to say now. And then in 1966, they used the Charger to enter NASCAR. The cars had too much lift, and so they introduced a lip spoiler on the rear deck lid of the trunk, and because of NASCAR homologation rules, you had to sell what you were racing at dealerships. So the first generation Charger actually became the first car to ever offer a factory option, even though it was dealer installed, a factory option trunk spoiler, just like that lip spoiler. And then in 1967, in the second and last year, they introduced the 440 Magnum V8, which was 7.2 liters, and the 6.3 liter V8 became the replacement for the 5.2 liter V8 at the bottom. And the first time the RT nameplate was ever used, with the RT package being introduced in 1967. So it was a short-lived 2-year generation for the first generation, and then we got into what's probably the best looking of all the old Chargers, the second generation.
This is one play he's not going to make. It's his turn to be on the receiving end of Dodge fever.
So the second generation was 1968 to 1970, only 3 years, another short-lived generation. And now, I misspoke before, they had the fastback design, now they had the flying buttresses, which just is like, you almost take the fastback, extend the trunk out a little bit, indent the window, you get the flying buttresses, but it's still overall the silhouette of the fastback. The 5.2-liter V8 was replaced with a 3.7-liter slant 6 as the standard engine with the 6.3-liter V8, both versions of them. There was one with 2-barrel carburetor and one with a 4-barrel carburetor as the next engine up. And then the RT came with the standard 440 Magnum, which wasn't a Hemi, but you could get the 426 Hemi as an option. The RT was first introduced in the first generation the last year. Well, 1968, the first year of the second generation, brought upon the Scat Pack name with the B logo, with the engine on its back, and the rear stripes. There was 2 thick stripes outlined by 4 thin stripes. Believe 4. There was 2 big stripes on the back, and that came on the RT. It was an RT Scat Pack. The legendary name that got carried on to this car eventually behind me. And the Charger popularity rose a lot. Everybody thinks of the Bullet Mustang, of course, from the famous chase in the movie Bullet, but the Charger was also involved in that chase, and it helped increase the popularity a lot. Coming from in 1969, they facelifted it. They gave it a new split grille and some new taillights. Overall, the shape was still the same. And then they introduced the Charger 500, where they had the flying buttress, and they brought the window back up to meet the flying buttress to reduce lift, and then they also changed to the Coronet grille to reduce drag, so that way it was better for racing, and you could still get it with the 440 Magnum or the 426 Hemi in the Charger 500. Then came the Charger Daytona, also for NASCAR. It's famous for the big nose cone and the big tall wing. Both added an insane amount of downforce because they were having such problems with lift. The downforce was needed. The interesting thing about the wing, which I didn't know until researching this video, the wing isn't just on top of the rear. It actually goes into the rear fenders and bolts onto the subframe, which not only did the wing add downforce, bolting in the subframe helped with directional stability when they were making them left turns. And that came standard with the 440 Magnum, and the 426 Hemi was a no-cost option, and it was eventually discontinued in 1970 so that they could make the Plymouth Roadrunner Superbird. If you have Daytona or Superbird, they're already very valuable. But if you have it with the 426 Hemi, they're very, very valuable. If I was rich, I would be seeking out one of those to put in the garage just to look at. Don't even need to drive it. And then finally in 1970, in the last year of the model year, they introduced the 440 6-pack V8. So it was a 440 cubic inch V8 with 6 carburetors, making, I didn't write it down, it's like 425 horsepower, an insane amount of horsepower, and a great way for the second generation to go out.
Here it is, solid luxury. New Charger SE, completely restyled.
Now the third generation, things started to move away from what you think of first when you think of the Charger. When you first think Charger, you think muscle car, you think performance car. Well, in the third generation from 1971 to 1974, it's amazing how short generations are, especially once we get into the modern Chargers. But they moved towards luxury cars more. They added features. They weren't as worried about speed. They were worried about comfort of ride and convenience features more than they were worried about just having a fast car. And not only that, in 1971, the Coronet and Charger became one in the same, whereas the 4-door model was the Coronet, the 2-door model was the Charger. Similar to how in this generation behind me, 4 doors was for the Charger, 2 doors was for the Challenger, even though they were on the same platform and largely the same. 1971 was also the last year for Hemi-powered RTs and the 446 pack. So once again, like I said, they moved more towards luxury and less towards performance. So the big loud V8 started to go away in 1971, which was the first year. Then in 1972, they introduced the Rally RALLYE, to replace the RT. Once again, they weren't worried about fast and loud, because then they took the 6.3 liter, which was standard in the RT, and put in a 6.6 liter with lower compression that made a lot less power, because they just weren't worried about power at this time. And then in 1973, the cars were longer, wider, and taller with a new grille and taillights. A small facelift, but overall, mostly the same car. But they stretched out the car and made it bigger to make it more comfortable. They brought it a little higher off the ground to make it feel less like a performance car and more like a luxury car. And then in the last model year, they replaced the 5.6 liter V8 with a more efficient but less powerful 5.9 liter V8. And so, why would they do this, right? The Charger was very popular as a muscle car in its first two generations. Even though the first generation did not sell like the Mustang did, it still sold well enough, and the second generation sold like crazy, especially after the Charger was in the bullet chase scene. But you got to remember what was starting to go on in the 70s, and that was the fuel crisis, with fuel prices skyrocketing, people in long lines, gas stations running out of fuel. And they wanted to keep the Charger alive, so they were like, we can't have these inefficient, very fast, very powerful V8s. But the Charger was starting to become a little bit softer, and so they were like, we're just going to lean into luxury car. It'll be less powerful, be a little more efficient, and it'll just be an American luxury car. And so that was the beginning of the end of the muscle Charger, and it only gets worse in the fourth generation.
Of the new personal mid-size cars, one is getting a lot of recognition.
So as we go on with the last couple generations before it goes away for a long time, there's just not a lot to say because it's just less and less interesting. So now the fourth generation Charger is full-on luxury car. They're not concerned with performance at all, and it was only from 75 to 78 because at the end of the day, the big, heavy vehicles were just never going to be really fuel efficient. And so they didn't sell very well, and they just weren't that interesting to the public. And so it was another short generation, and this was full luxury car. In 1975, only the SE trim was available, the special edition. It's just a luxury car. And it was offered with a 5.2 liter V8, a 5.9 liter V8. There's 3 different 6.6 liter V8s. All just not focused as much on power. Obviously, you still focus on some power with big V8s, but not like they used to. And because of the design of the fourth generation Charger, it was too square. And so in NASCAR, they raced with the second gen Charger, or the third gen rather, until 1978 once the Charger was gone and they were no longer racing because they weren't selling a Charger, so they couldn't race with the Charger. And so that really shows you that the fourth generation was not about performance when they didn't even use that design in NASCAR anymore. And then finally in 1976, they had 4 trims. They had the base trim, the sport trim, which only came with that 2.7 liter slant 6. It was a 3.7 liter slant 6. And then the SE trim and the Daytona trim, which came with the different V8s, but the Daytona trim was really just a features and appearance package, no extra performance like we had in the past with the RT and the RT Scat Pack. And then the base and sport were dropped after 1966, and in 1977, the base and sport were rebadged as Coronet 2-door models with that 3.7 liter slant 6. And then in the 1978 year, it was just a carryover year. Nothing really changed. And that was the death of the even somewhat cool Chargers. And the Charger would go away for a couple years until the 5th generation, which just a disaster.
Remember when the 426 Hemi made Dodge Charger a legend? Today that legend lives again in Dodge Charger 2.2.
So as I mentioned, the 5th generation, just a disaster. The Charger was not really the Charger anymore. In fact, the Charger nameplate was just slapped on the Peugeot and Dodge Omni, and it was front-wheel drive. It was inline 4. This surprisingly actually lasted from 82 to 87, the longest generation of any Charger at this point. But this is where it really shows that the US got rocked by the fuel crisis, because now we had a front-wheel drive hot hatch. It's not even that hot, especially in the beginning. And so that started out with a 1.6 liter Peugeot inline 4 naturally aspirated until 1983. Actually, I have that backwards. In the beginning, it was a 1.7 liter Volkswagen inline four until that died in 1983. And they moved on to a joint venture engine between Chrysler and Peugeot and put in a 1.6 liter inline four, naturally aspirated, just slow. In the beginning, you could get a 4-speed Volkswagen manual transmission, and then you could get a 5-speed manual transmission or a 3-speed as the optional transmissions. At least it was finally up to a 5-speed at this time, a much more normal transmission. And like I mentioned, in 81 and 82, it was just a rebadged Omni to the point where the Omni 025, it was a performance package in the beginning. It said Charger and all that, so we're calling it the Charger. And then in 83, it was the Omni was officially renamed the Charger. And in 1983, we also got the Shelby Charger, one of the only ways that this car is even remotely cool. And that still ran with the naturally aspirated Peugeot inline four until 1985 when it got the Shelby Turbo 1 that actually brought it up to 146 horsepower. In the original Volkswagen engine, it had 107 horsepower, and then with the Peugeot, it had 110. And obviously back then cars were a lot lighter, but it was still slow for even the time. 146 was starting to be respectable. And then in 1987, Shelby purchased 1,000 Shelby Chargers for himself and converted them to the GLHS, which is the goes like hell s'more, because the old Shelby Charger went like hell, but this was going like hell some more. So there was 1,000 goes like hell s'mores, and they got the Turbo 2 motor from Shelby, rated 175 horsepower, and they also got adjustable Coney shocks. There are some other upgrades, right, like some brake upgrade between the Shelby Charger and the regular, and some other small upgrades. The real highlights are they at least got turbos and adjustable Coney shocks. Now the GLHSs, they go for decent money. They're like low 20s. I don't think I would pay that for them unless I just had a lot of money or I was just out of cars I wanted to try. 175 is fine. It was light, and the Coney shocks were adjustable, and they were good suspension, all that. But a lot of people that love the Charger and the Charger nameplate don't even consider the 5th gen Charger to be a Charger. And when you're talking to a lot of people, there's a lot of people that really only consider the first 2 gens, and some of them consider the modern Charger, some of them don't, depending on if they're like old school muscle heads. And you find less and less people as you go on with the 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation that consider it a Charger. And a lot of hardcore Charger people don't consider the 5th gen a Charger at all and don't like to talk about it, similar to how Mustang people don't really like to talk about the Mustang 2. And so the 5th gen Charger was a disaster, and it really killed the Charger name for a very long time. In fact, when the 6th generation came out way later, which we'll talk about here in a second, it was, a relief and kind of a surprise that the Charger name was back, because the 5th gen Charger was so bad that it had killed the Charger from 87 until the 6th generation came out. And the 6th generation was a lot cooler. So the 6th generation came out in 2006, so almost 20 full years later without a Charger, about 19, 20 years. And the Charger now was, of course, the 4-door sedan that we know. We've seen them as police cars. We've seen them now especially as beaters that people sell and buy cheap on Facebook Marketplace. But back in 2006 when it came out, it was really exciting. You could get a V8, cool-looking sedan. They were good-looking for the time. I think the 2015 facelift was the best looking in the modern Charger, which we'll get to here after the 6th generation. But the 6th generation, it hit at the perfect time when everybody was doing retro modern design. The Mustang came out in 2005. I think it's somewhere to 2002 to 2004. We had the PT Cruiser, the HHR, the Prowler. It hit right when people were, into the retro modern design, and it looked like a modern car, but you could see the retro touches that called back to the good old days of the Charger. And so you had this hardcore looking muscle sedan. People were really excited about it. Interestingly enough, it actually used components from steering to chassis to subframe from the W211 Mercedes E-Class and the W220 S-Class. It used components from that because that was back in the Daimler-Chrysler era where Mercedes and Chrysler were under one roof together. And so it took parts from that to make the new Charger. The base trim, which was just unnamed, had either a 3.5 liter V6 or a 2.7 liter V6, and a 4 or 5 speed automatic, with the 5 speed being optional, and rear wheel drive. Then the SE Plus trim came with as the base trim, but with more features, same motors. The SXT came with even more features added, and now you could get all-wheel drive, where with the unnamed base trim and the SE, you could only get rear-wheel drive, but now you could get a all-wheel drive V6 in the SXT. But if you wanted the new 5.7 liter Hemi, you had to get the RT trim, which you could get in rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive. And God, I wish they kept making cars in all-wheel drive, but they didn't, because Scat Pack all-wheel drive would have been so much fun, and would have made me not be in the place I am with this car now, where I'm looking to replace it. I don't know. That might not be true. But the RT came with even more features, more options, and you could also get the new 5.7 liter Hemi. Then you could move all the way up to the SRT8 with the 6.1 liter V8. If you want to mod a Hemi, 6.1 liter is a great place to start, better than the 6.4 in the car behind me. And then there's even more features, even more upgraded options, but you could only get this one in rear-wheel drive. It's a shame nothing with the SRT badge ever came in all-wheel drive. But it is what it is. We obviously can't change that now. I just wish it did, because they did make an all-wheel drive Charger. And so then they also had the Daytona package come back. It was a package for the RT, which meant you got the 5.7 liter V8, but a more luxury interior, a distinct appearance package with some graphics on the outside, distinct wheels, I think. But that was only available from 2006 to 2009, and then it went away. And the Super B also came out. You know, it has the B logo on it. It has an homage with the stripes on the back, and you could get that with the 6.1 liter V8. So, you know, the Daytona was the luxury appearance package for the RT, and the Super B was the luxury and appearance package for the SRT8. But that was the 6th generation. It was a great return to form, but it was only going to get better from here.
A lot of car companies measure their cars in miles per gallon. But what kind of miles are we talking here? Miles that pass by unnoticed? Boring miles? Or are they adrenaline-pumping, highway-tearing, pacemaker-triggering, rubber-burning?
So then we have the 7th generation of Charger, which, of course, I have not driven the old Chargers, but in my opinion, the 7th generation, especially post-facelift, is the best generation of Charger. This generation was from 2011 to 2023 with a major facelift in 2015 that made it look, that, you know, to some, kind of myself, considers it really like 7.5 generation, 8th generation, especially with what the 8th generation is. But this was peak Charger in my opinion. You know, you had the most modern looks, you had the most modern tech, especially later in the generation. You had the most insane Chargers ever in the late generation. Challenger's even more insane. But you still had old school muscle look, still have an old school overhead cam, push rod, loud, big V8 that sounds incredible. Even before you got the 6.4 here. So this, like I said, was 2011 to 2023. In 2011, it debuted with a new 3.6 liter V6, which was used for the entire run. You know, updated power at the facelift, but 3.6 liter V6 was the whole V6. And the 5.7 liter Hemi V8 returned, slightly tweaked, of course. So the 8-speed automatic was introduced in 2012 as an option, which of course would later become standard. And in 2012, the SRT8 introduced the 6.4 liter Hemi, which back then made 475 horsepower, which would later be updated. There is a load of appearance packages pre-facelift. You had the 2011 RT Mopar 11, which was an appearance package. And a lot of these also came with other options and upgraded interior and stuff. But the 2013 RT Blacktop, the 2013 Daytona, the 2013 all-wheel drive Sport, which you could get on all levels except for the SRT, the 2013 and 14 SRT8 392 package, the 2014 Redline package, and the 2014 100th anniversary package, of course celebrating the 100th anniversary of Dodge. Too many to go over each one of them, but those are all the different special editions that came pre-facelift, and then in 2015, we got the facelift.
Well, there they are, our founding fathers. And that thing behind them, that's their great, 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 great grandson.
that gave us, in my opinion, the best looking Charger. The Charger that my 2018 behind me was a part of that facelift. Almost an 8th generation. We'll call it 7.5 to meet in the middle. The ZF 8-speed became the standard transmission, and it is a fantastic transmission. That is one of my favorite things about the car, is that transmission is great. When you use it in manual mode, it shifts quick. The downshifts are fun. Everything about it is a great transmission. The SRT 392 and the RT Scat Pack were introduced in 2015. The big difference is they both have the 6.4-liter Hemi V8, which now had 485 horsepower. But the SRT, which stopped after 2018, whereas the RT Scat Pack went all the way through the end of the generation in 2023, it had adaptable suspension. That was the big difference. And then there's a few other little things, but the big difference was the adaptable suspension, which I wish they continued into the RT Scat Pack, even if it was in the 2019 and I wouldn't have gotten it. I hate that they got rid of that after developing that. But obviously, the big mamma jamma, the King Charger that was introduced in 2015 was the Hellcat that we all know and love, with that 6.2-liter supercharged V8, 707 horsepower, just an insane thing. I believe at the time, it was the most horsepower in a non-supercar. And it's still very high up there, despite the fact, like, the Corvette, which is definitely a supercar now, and the ZR1 and ZR1X having 1,000 and, like, 1,200 horsepower, respectively. And then in 2020, the wide body, which had been available on the Challenger for a couple years at that point, came over to the Charger, and you could get the Charger wide body with I think they had 325 standard tires instead of 275 standard. So big tires, big wide body. And then finally in 2021, we got the Charger Red Eye, which was the Hellcat, bumped up to 797 horsepower. An insane car, an insane amount of power. I wish that the Charger got the Demon and Demon 170 and all that. I understand why it went to the Challenger, right? The two-door seems more like the real performance car. And not the performance sedan. I love the performance sedan more, and that's why I got that instead of the Challenger when I could have gotten either or. But that was really the end of people's love for the Charger, and going into the 8th generation, the generation we have now, is where the love is lost.
The thing you need to know about the Dodge brand is that we always get to where we are going without ever forgetting where we've been.
So finally, we have the 8th generation, which came out in 2024 and is our current Charger. It was originally announced, you know this if you're watching this probably, as a 2-door EV. I don't remember what the power is, but it's extremely heavy. It's got a lot of power, but it's not fast compared to other cars. I think it looks really good personally. A lot of people don't like the way it looks. I love the way it looks. I don't necessarily want it as an EV, although for a great deal, I would actually get one, especially with 4 doors returning this year in 2026. But last year in 2025, towards the end, they launched the Hurricane Inline-6 Turbo Power Charger, which has 500 and something horsepower, which is more than the V8 in the Scat Pack, which had 485 horsepower. And so, yeah, it's a fast car, but it's still not fast because it's such a heavy car. And from everything I hear sitting, it's kind of awkward, especially when it's not an EV anymore because the floor is really high in it because it was supposed to be an EV. And so we'll see how that does. There's a lot of rumors of V8s coming back to the Charger. I doubt we'll get just another naturally aspirated big V8 because it won't be as fast as the Hurricane Inline-6. So unless they make it the base trim, which would be odd because the fuel economy would be worse than the Hurricane and all that, I expect the only way we get a V8, which is what's rumored, is we get a Hellcat, and I really hope that we see the Hellcat motor return to the Charger. I think it looks great. It would be awesome with a Hellcat, but we'll have to wait and see on that. This is the Charger that is the history of the generations of the Charger, why things changed, what directions they went in, it going away and why it went away. So I hope you learned something, because I definitely learned something doing this research. I knew a lot of this. I learned some of this. And I love the Charger. I hope it has a good future, and I hope it's not another nameplate that ends up dying. And if I hope it dies, I hope it can have a triumphant return like it did in 2006. But that's the Charger. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in learning more about the Hemi, a few months back, I did a history of the Hemi. I'll link that down below. I'm also going to be doing a history of the whole brand of Dodge, so keep an eye out for that. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell if you want to see that or any of my upcoming car content first. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below. What did you learn? What did you know? Did I get something wrong? What do you think of the Charger? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you so much again for watching. I will see you in the next video. Have a good day. Bye.